Hi, and welcome to Jaynes' show. This is a first for me. It's an on-request show. And the topic will be hypnosis. What was the original question that kind of led to the request was, do I believe in hypnosis? I think even more specifically, do I believe there is such a thing as hypnosis? And after we get past the is part and remove it, the question becomes, what can you tell me about hypnosis? Or there could be specific questions about how it works or why it works and things like that. And that's the question that I'm going to take on. And the ideas will be largely based on a book called The Origin of Consciousness in the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind by Julian and Jaynes. Let's see if we can have that show up at all. Not very well. That's a little better. And there's Julian and Jaynes. Parts of his ideas are modified by general semantics, but this is basically based on the chapter of his book on the bicameral mind. And the basic idea is that there's an earlier organization of our mind before what we have today. We'll call what we have today the subjective mind. And the transition from bicamerality, from the bicameral mind to the subjective mind, in some ways took place somewhere around 2,000 to 5,000 years ago. And it wasn't a sharp event, but that may have been around the time that the subjective mind truly took over. It probably started much further back. And of course, there might be details, different types of minds if we trace our human species back. But it probably goes back to when we were non-human primates and we had minds that were fairly close to what we have now compared to most of the animals. And when we became Homo sapiens, we probably became even closer. And I'm not too sure about how long that lasted, but we're talking in the range of hundreds of thousands of years to millions of years with the bicameral mind. And then in the fairly recent, even historical past, if you accept history as beginning with mankind learning to write, which may have been connected with the transition to a subjective mind. Certainly Julian and Jaynes thought so, if I can speak for him. So, Sorry for the long-winded distraction there. The basic idea of the bicameral mind is that the two hemispheres of the brain, and if I was more prepared, I'd give you diagrams, but I think everybody has an idea about the two hemispheres of the brain and what they look like, were much more separate than they are today. That one half of the brain handled day-to-day events and normal tasks, eating, getting up, going to work as whatever you did. Probably didn't look much like work, but you might have to go out on a hunting party or plant crops or work on the pyramids, either the Egyptian pyramids or the Mayan, American, South American pyramids, or whatever enormous structure like Stonehenge. In societies that had bicameral minds and had gotten past the requirement to spend all your day working on survival tasks and had what we would call leisure time or free time, that time might have been required to be spent on a society-wide task, something that the leader wanted done, building some pyramids. And we could talk more about that kind of endlessly, but I just wanted to get across the basic idea that one half of the brain would be primarily devoted to doing routine tasks, and the other half of the brain would deal with novel tasks or learning how to do something. And in the bicameral mind, those two halves are more separate than they are today. And the connection between them would be through language, that the part that handles day-to-day tasks would be told what to do by the part that handles learning and novel experiences. And this is a deep topic, and I'm not going to go into it very much, but that, in a sense, is the origin of religion and gods and so forth. The original gods were the part of our mind that dealt with new things. And we certainly still have the split into the two halves, but they're much more integrated now. And if we go back in time, eventually we reach the bicameral mind, or even earlier, when they were not quite as integrated. What hypnosis means to me and anyone who believes in the bicameral mind theory is that essentially the hemisphere, the part of the brain, and it doesn't necessarily have to be limited to a hemisphere, it can be a more fuzzy definition than that, but the part that deals with learned experiences, under hypnosis, that part is open to receiving instructions from a language source, but it's a language source that is outside the brain mind. So essentially, you're opening up your brain, a part of your brain that will accept commands and that goes back very far in terms of time, is available to be told what to do by an external source of language instead of an internal source. And this mechanism probably has its roots in the structure of the group and society, essentially that people want a leader to tell them what to do. If we go back in time, that instruction was more and more fundamental, more and more directly speaking from the leader to the part of you that wants instructions, that can take instructions, and possibly when the bicameral mind was in its prime, when it was really the way society was structured, there would be a ceremony or some type of authority that would allow authority to give instructions to an individual directly, and that would be controlled by the novelty learning part of their brain, what in ancient times and Julian Jaynes calls the Ka, K-A. So that's the explanation, and I've had 12 minutes so far. I want to check on whether or not sorry for the delay. Talk among yourselves or have a drink. And did you see the whole thing? Sorry for this break, folks. Well, let's see. I'm trying to think of whether or not there's more to say. Thank you. I'm trying to think of whether or not there is more to say. You can ask questions on texting. I'm kind of surprised that you can't chat on the built-in chat. When Natalie Gelman has her live streams, we can use the built-in texting capability during the show. Let's see. What else can I tell you about the origin of consciousness in the breakdown of the bicameral mind that I haven't already for this video. I guess this, in a way, this will be a book report on the origin of consciousness and the breakdown of the bicameral mind. So it starts out with the problem of consciousness. And he really explains what he's going to try to explain with this theory. He's talking about all the different things that we lump under the idea of consciousness. And it's a really interesting section. He's kind of eliminating possibilities, like he tries out different kinds of explanations or definitions of consciousness, like consciousness being a form of learning, concepts, there's many different possibilities that are brought up and then knocked down. And then he brings up consciousness as a metaphor and the origin of civilization. And he thinks of civilization as simply what you have to have in order to let large groups of people live together. And then goes into the Greek and Romans, and particularly Mesopotamia. And all of this is extensively talked about. There's diagrams showing the artwork at various stages to kind of show the progress of civilization and the changes of how people looked at the world and dealt with things. And it all, or at least a major part, is a change of mind in Mesopotamia. And then we get into the quest for authorization and consciousness as it exists now. So we really have three parts of the book. The first is what consciousness is. Then what happened to change from the bicameral mind to the subjective mind and consciousness, and then the effects of consciousness in the present world. And there's a part that I want to read from which I think expresses it really nicely before he gets to the discussion of the bicameral mind in the world as it exists around us. We are now at last in a position where we can look back and see the history of mankind on this planet in its proper values for the first time and understand some of the chief features of the last 3 millennia as vestiges of a previous mentality. Our view of human history here must be that of a furthest grandeur. We must try to see man against his entire evolutionary background, where his civilizations, including our own, are but as mountain peaks in a particular range against the sky, and from which we must force ourselves into an intellectual distance so that we see its contours aright. And from this prospect, a millennium is an exceedingly short period of time for so fundamental a change as from bicamerality to consciousness. We, at the end of the 2nd millennium AD, are still, in a sense, deep in this transition to a new mentality. And all about us lie the remnants of our recent bicameral past. We have our houses of gods, which record our births, define us, marry us, and bury us, receive our confessions, and intercede with the gods to forgive us our trespasses. Our laws are based upon values which without their divine pendency would be empty and unenforceable. Our national mottos and hymns of state are usually divine invocations. Our kings, presidents, judges, and officers begin their tenures with oaths to the now silent deities taken upon the writings of those who have last heard them. The most obvious and important carryover from the previous mentality is thus our religious heritage in all its labyrinthine beauty and variety of forms. The overwhelming importance of religion, both in general world history and in the history of the average world individual, is of course very clear from any objective standpoint, even though a scientific view of man often seems embarrassed at acknowledging this most obvious fact. For in spite of all that rationalist, materialist science has implied since the scientific revolution, mankind as a whole has not, does not, and perhaps cannot relinquish his fascination with some human type of relationship to a greater and holy other, some mysterium tremendum with powers and intelligences beyond all left hemispheric categories, something necessarily indefinite and unclear, to be approached and felt in awe and wonder and almost speechless worship, rather than in clear conception, something that for modern religious people communicates in truth of feeling rather than in what can be verbalized by the left hemisphere. And so, what in our time can be more truly felt when least named, a patterning of self and numinous others from which, in times of our darkest distress, none of us can escape, even as the infinitely milder distress of decision-making brought out that relationship 3 millennia ago. So I'm not going to keep reading, although it's, a reading as an audio book of The Origin of Consciousness would certainly be worthwhile. I kind of assume that it is available. I haven't checked, but certainly the origin of consciousness is still in print. Excuse me. So I don't know if there's as much requirement for me to do an audiobook of it, and the publisher actually might get a little upset at that. But that's a question that we could look at later. So that's the introduction to the section that's about today. And he has a chapter on hypnosis where he explains how it works that I've already talked about. And there's another chapter about mental illness that kind of explains how many forms of mental illness are regression to the bicameral mind, and most specifically schizophrenia. There is a chapter on that, and it's basically explained as the subjective mind under stress reverts to a bicameral organization, and the various hallucinations are the instructions from the right hemisphere. Presumably, its way of controlling, the left hemisphere would be not just by telling it what to do, but by showing it pictures. And if you think about the brain's ability, I shouldn't say brain, the brain-mind combined, about their ability to create our world, that essentially everything you see and hear and touch is being brought to you as coded messages, interpreted and turned into what you see and the world that you interact with. You can see how a part of you that had the ability to affect that process based on what it wanted could essentially create a theater of the mind in which you would do whatever it wanted. And that is the core of most, or at least some, mental illness, and specifically schizophrenia. Now, through the lens of general semantics, that changes. And Jaynes' entire theory changes somewhat when you think about terms like brain and mind, which general semantics doesn't typically want you to use separately unless there's a reason for it based on what you're trying to explain about human beings. Sorry, lost the train of thought there. If you think about what the brain-mind does from a general semantics perspective, and think about going back in time, deep time, hundreds of thousands and millions of years, the meaning of mind changes over that time. There would still have been a subconscious for some amount of time going back, but the subconscious would be less and less important as the cortex, I was pointing to my cortex, can you tell? Changes and becomes less and less of our experiences. It certainly still exists in the primates and presumably in dolphins, but it exists less as we go back further and as we get into other mammals and reptiles. There essentially is no cortex in the human sense, which in a way I'm defining the neocortex. All right, I feel like I'm blathering now, and I'm wondering what else I can tell you. And how to relate science and sanity to the ideas that are put forth here. So these are some of the other things. This is kind of getting to be the book report on the Bicameral Mind book. In book 3, so we're divided into 3 books: The Mind of Man, The Witness of History, and Vestiges of the Bicameral Mind in the Modern World. And the sections of book 3 are kind of interesting. The Quest for Authorization, which is an interesting kind of introduction to the subject of what pieces of the bicameral mind are still most clearly going on in our current world. And the next of the 6 sections are of profits and possession. And that I think is maybe clearer than anything else, that the prophets were people who still could experience the bicameral mind as most people were switching to the subjective mind. And that almost comically makes it sound like an individual would decide when to switch. I'm not sure to what degree that's true, although you can see people that you meet today switching between the subjective mind and the bicameral mind, often children. The next is of poetry and music, and that's a very interesting section that talks about the origin of poetry and music and how they relate to the bicameral mind. And then there's a chapter on hypnosis and a chapter on schizophrenia. And the last chapter is the auguries of science, talking about how much science has taken over in our very recent past. I would say since the Enlightenment, which I don't even know when that officially began, I suppose around 1200 or 1500, something like that. So we're talking about 500 or so years, and certainly science, in terms of shaping the world we live in, really began in the 1800s with electricity spreading around the world, and of course in the 20th century with the advent of mass communications such as radio and television, and now with the smartphone, it has truly taken on a life of its own, and mostly deals with the subjective mind, but occasionally taps into the bicameral mind as well. I'm searching for how to relate specific ideas from general semantics to bicamerality and the origin of consciousness and the breakdown of the bicameral mind. And I suppose that in some sense, general semantics, through its delaying of a response, tries to get the full subjective mind and the cortex, which has to be given time to process compared to the lower or other parts of the brain, mind. That general semantics could be looked at as an attempt to let the subjective mind maintain control and not let the elemental or primitive animal mind take control, except when we want to for fun. And that's a subject that I've recently been kind of taken by. When is the elemental mind more to be in control? And I don't feel prepared to talk about that, but it's a very interesting topic. So I guess if we don't have any more questions, I'm going to consider this to be about the end of the first On Request show. You'll be the judge of how successful that was. It was essentially an attempt to answer the question, do I believe in hypnosis? And the short answer to that very elemental question is yes, very much so. And I would not be at all sure that everybody would have the same belief and understanding of what hypnosis is. And I would largely go along with Julian Jaynes' explanation of hypnosis from the chapter in The Origin of Consciousness in the breakdown of the bicameral mind. So I think I'll put back the URL. There's where you can get to the text of Science and Sanity. We don't have a similar title card for The Origin of Consciousness and the breakdown of the bicameral mind. But if you really want to find it, I'm sure you can based on that and Google and Amazon and all. I guess I don't need to use any of the other title cards I've got. Thank you for watching. If you want to subscribe or receive notification of live streams, I don't know whether anybody who's watched this show would want to, then by all means, please do. This is April 1st, 2023. It's now 10:43 p.m. And this is copyright myself, Leonard Fisher, Tuna Jeans, but is licensed under a Creative Commons license with attribution, please. And I think that'll be it. Goodbye, goodbye. And have a